Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to our Cyberpunk special.
Yes, we're very excited to be participating in Cyberpunk Week along with Geek Elite Media and Lore Party. And speaking of Lore Party, our guest on this episode is the incredible Connor Howard. Connor, thank you for joining us.
Howdy. Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And before we get off and running and talking about Cyberpunk games, I do briefly at the top want to mention we are not going to be talking about Cyberpunk 2077. There's been a lot going on with CD Projekt Red and that game. I am in no position to expound greatly on it, but let's just say that a lot of shit has come up to do with them. I'm happy to provide references if you reach out to me, but we are also raising money for Trans Lifeline. There will be a link in the show notes, so feel free to check that out. There will be an episode with all of the podcasters from the multiple networks coming together to talk about the cyberpunk genre and 2077 a little more at length. So keep an eye out for that as well. But today we are talking about the genre of cyberpunk in video games, which I feel like has been in video games all the way since the beginning with the Nintendo and the Atari. I feel like there have been hints of cyberpunk, but also the word cyberpunk has I feel like it's kind of become this amalgamation, right? Like no clear meaning of what it means to video games. There are certain games that have come out that are clearly cyberpunk. Obviously, Cyberpunk 2077 being one of them. It's in the name and based on the TTRPG. But, I feel like the lines have blurred over the years in gaming as far as what is considered cyberpunk.
Yeah, I think it has fragmented a bit for sure. It's taken a lot of facets.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's the there's that weird phenomenon in video games when a certain kind of game comes along, it becomes the genre name until a new genre title is determined, like Doom clones becoming first-person shooters, and roguelikes still living in that world. But cyberpunk is odd because it started as a genre within novels, sort of the 60s and 70s sort of hard sci-fi, your Harlan Ellisons and Philip K. Dicks. But then it also became a tabletop game, which now has the video game coming out. So it's that sort of thing of like trying to look it up online. Like you want to look up cyberpunk games. Oh, you mean the upcoming cyberpunk? No.
Yeah.
No. It's a weird sort of recursive genre situation there.
Yeah, it's interesting how it has morphed into so many different things to so many different people over the years. It's almost like subjective. Like, what do you think cyberpunk is? And that's what it is to you. But there are some facets that kind of stay there no matter what form the games take. There's always some tenets that sort of are fundamental to the concept of cyberpunk, like just technology gone wrong, transhumanism, humanity becoming more than it already is. There are some themes that you really pick up on, and I think that's what keeps people engaged with the concept of cyberpunk over the years, even if the books turn into movies and the movies turn into games and the comics turn into other games, that kind of thing. It's always going to translate into a new medium and take on a new form, but there's always going to be that underlying theme of technology is either setting you free or imprisoning you, or kind of both at the same time. There's really interesting themes that always seem to stay there in the DNA of cyberpunk, which is really cool to me.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of the two big, and yeah, you point out that thing where it's either setting us free or it's trapping us. One of the big consistencies that I find in cyberpunk, or at least the cyberpunk that I like to consume, is sort of this interesting idea of the inherent possibilities of technology. And yes, transhumanism and futurism. And I suppose that is a way that technology is handled and dealt with as well, because you can have something that is made open source and available to everybody, but then, as is often the case with these sorts of things, ideas trickle upward until they become something that is owned by a richer or powerful entity. And then it becomes everybody should have the right to pay for what I now own. And the sort of push and pull back and forth, the idea of, and it's very interesting to look at different cyberpunk properties, and some of them look at the idea of mechanical or organic enhancement as trapping you or leaving you beholden to a corporate entity, versus this allows you to become exactly who or what you want to be.
Right.
It's incredible.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting also is like as an adult gamer versus a kid gamer, because as most of us were, I was an idiot as a kid. You know, I feel like that's just kind of across the board true for most people. And
that's our right.
That's our right
Exactly.
to be dumb as kids. But I feel like, you know, I never looked at a game and went, oh, it's this genre or this type of game. As of when we're recording, I very recently recorded my Super Mario 64 episode of Side Quest, which will be out, I think, by the time this airs. I guess we'll see. But anyway, like when I was recording that episode, I was talking about the origins of the 3D platformer. But when I played that game the first time when I was 13, I didn't know any of that. I was just like, oh, cool, it's Mario. He's 3D. Awesome. And I feel like with Cyberpunk, there was a lot of that too. Like when I played the original Deus Ex, I had no idea. I was just like, oh, cool, shooter. Oh, this is fun. You know, I suck at it, but cool. And it wasn't until Human Revolution, which was like the modern rebirth of Deus Ex, that I was like, and of course, admittedly, it had an incredible narrative, but I was like, oh, I'm starting to understand this genre, especially within video games. And like, you know, Adam Jensen and his character and the company he works for, like all of that and the technology and whether it's good or bad and cybernetics and how, you know, there's riots in the street, like all of that stuff really plays into the idea of cyberpunk and losing your humanity. And Adam Jensen is a really interesting character, and you really get to know the struggle through him and his mods. Like, and as you upgrade yourself, you know, through the game mechanics, you get better in combat, but you understand you're losing some sense of humanity. It's really interesting. And I think that's where the narrative games really get me, like Human Revolution, is like when they incorporate upgrading into the narrative and loss of humanity, because tons of games have upgrades. Like one of my favorite games of all time, Mass Effect, you're constantly upgrading yourself. And I feel like the biotic stuff in Mass Effect could be argued as, because some people are natural biotics, but all humans are not. They have implants put into their body so they can use biotics. You could argue, and with the Omni tools and all the other stuff, you can argue it's a different kind of version of cyberpunk and that losing your humanity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You bring up the idea of losing humanity the more you replace your body with machinery. It makes me think of probably one of my favorite cyberpunk properties, Shadowrun.
Ooh, yeah.
And it's not technically a video game, although there have been video game adaptations of Shadowrun.
They've tried several times.
Yeah, and actually Shadowrun Returns is a really good one. I'd recommend that one. It's kind of like an isometric classic RPG, kind of in the vein of Baldur's Gate.
Is that the Genesis one?
No, it's actually on PC. It's on Steam right now. There's like some expansions. It's relatively recent. It came out a few years ago.
Oh, cool.
There was also some sort of multiplayer shooter on Xbox, like 360, that didn't do so well. So Shadowrun has made the leap to video games, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But at its core, it's a tabletop RPG that I've played many times and really enjoyed. I'm a D&D freak, but I do also have a special place in my heart for Shadowrun. But I like that you bring that up, Matt, as just, you know, losing something with each upgrade, because that's a mechanic in Shadowrun. In that RPG, if you play as a character and you decide to spend, you know, resources or money or whatever on cybernetic upgrades, it gives you new abilities and makes you more effective in some ways, but you also lose something called the body stat. You just actually, like, there's a penalty to each upgrade, and I think there's like a limit to how many you can install before you're just no longer like a person. you're basically a cyborg. Like, yeah, so there's some kind of upper limit on upgrades, and I like how that, like you said, it's meshed into not just a hard limit on you as a player, it's also part of your character. So like, yeah, you can chop off your arm and give yourself a robo arm, but what are you losing? And I like when a product, an entertainment product, makes us think about things like that. Like, what are you really losing when you do this to yourself? And like, you may think it's purely for gain, but there's a price too.
It's funny that you bring up Shadowrun, because there's actually a great Shadowrun podcast that I listened to that was created by Mike Regnetta, famously of the Idea Channel fame and other places, called Fun City. And like I don't want to spoil the show because it's fairly narrative, even though it's an actual play podcast. But there's a moment where their resident cybernetic character loses his humanity. After a certain point, he has like a threshold, and they're playing the tabletop Shadowrun with some mods to make it more cinematic, where he just operates emotionless and like he blacks out and his body takes over. And like, it's really interesting. And I don't know if it's direct result of the cybernetics, or just something, a flaw to his character specifically, but it was still really cool to see. And then like he had traumatic experience and relapse afterwards. And like, it's just really cool to see when someone integrates that something into a game, because obviously we live in a world now where prosthetics have come a long way, and there are folks with robotic arms.
Yeah,
now.
there's a 3D printed Metal Gear Solid arm.
Right.
Yeah. And like nobody we're actively trying to make sure people don't consider those people less human, right? Like, you know, people with disabilities are human and people just like anyone else. And so it's interesting in real life to see that push, whereas in a lot of fantasy, it's been the other way around, where it's like the loss of humanity and like, are you less of a person because you don't have your full body, which are, of course, in real life, we say, no, it doesn't, you know, you're a person regardless. But it's interesting to see like someone with a pacemaker. Are they a robot now? I mean, not necessarily. And there are artificial hearts now. So like, it's just interesting as real life approaches some of the things that we only dreamed of in these games, where the crossover happens a lot.
Well, there's also, I mean, if you want a philosophical diatribe about all of this stuff, like y'all can get off the call and I'll just record myself for the next 3 hours. I have a lot of feelings and thoughts on this, philosophically speaking. But I think one of the interesting pushes in that is the idea that certainly within Shadowrun and within a lot of these other games, you are enhancing yourself to better interact with the mechanics of the game. And the mechanics of the game are rarely pedestrian situations. Even the things that aren't necessarily combat oriented are definitely, if not violent acts, are extreme acts or radical actions. And so if you are upgrading yourself, you know, if you are replacing an arm or something with a prosthetic or something that, or a prosthetic leg that helps you walk better, ambulate better, that's one thing. That helps you in your day-to-day life. But if you are replacing your arm with a machine gun...
It's a little different.
Like, yeah, the joke, you can't hug your kids with nuclear arms. You can't... You know, Jax from Mortal Kombat did not upgrade his arms to do yard work.
No.
I can hug my daughter better now.
It's the argument about, like, what superpower do you want? I want to fly. Why? Just to get the feeling of it? Do you work in theater and it helps you rig lights? How is it going to help you as a patent lawyer, the ability to fly? And so the notion of pushing back on your humanity is making either the willful choice or as the character or you as the player to choose to push your function, your ideas, your everything else towards sort of a non-community aspect. And because the upwing politics, the idea of we lift ourselves as a community through technology, through futurism and everything else, those are the positive aspects. But if you are a, you know, console cowboy fighting against the corporations that are running the world, oh man, what a fantasy Cyberpunk is. But that is choosing to, it's just the same way that becoming a soldier is giving up a bit of your humanity, it could be argued.
Right.
In that same way. And it's an interesting, and it also prevents those of us who play games who like to min-max and get all of the upgrades from being like, there's no downside to all of this. But it makes an interesting push.
It is a really interesting point that both of you have made about that dichotomy of, are you augmenting yourself out of necessity to have a better quality of life? Or are you doing it out of like vanity or just a dedication to power or things like that? It's really interesting to look at, you know, the real life parallels. If someone has a, you know, horrible accident and they're missing a limb now, there are prosthetics that just make it easier for them to go through life day to day like any of us would. Then you look at a game like we've mentioned Deus Ex before, but especially in Human Revolution, where you see that game world, prosthetics, or they call them augmentations, augs, so to speak, they become a fashion statement. Not just a you know, quality of life improvement, but they're trendy, they're cool, and the rich people get them. So that means that everyone wants them. And you know, not to get political, but that's kind of how it always works. When wealthy people have something, that trickles down and it becomes trendy and popular.
And that is what I mean. Ideals trickle upward, technology trickles downward.
Interesting. That's deep. I like that. And we see that happen in real life and in media. So that's interesting.
Yeah, because it's often proven that the technology that is made, very often, you know, people can make their own Wi-Fi routers with the right materials and a little bit of know-how. It's not that the materials necessarily are expensive, but we're made to believe they are, or it doesn't look as good, or it doesn't interact as perfectly as, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, It is. I think it comes back to the meaning of what punk is. I think you mentioned, Geoff, earlier about the idea of a corporation. There's always some sort of higher power, but it's always just run by human beings. It's a corporate entity that's always present in these stories.
Yes.
And I think mega corporations running everything is also another very fundamental theme of Cyberpunk. And I think that ties into what the punk part of Cyberpunk is. Punk, I mean, just to I could be totally wrong on this, is my take on it, but punk usually to me means there's some sort of counterculture. There's like a pushback against an establishment. That's what punk is all about. Mm-hmm. And in Cyberpunk specifically, seems like there's always some sort of mega corporation or group of mega corporations that run everything. And the punk part of it is, I'm going to turn this technology that runs this establishment against itself. And that's usually where the story or the conflict of a Cyberpunk product comes in. And that kind of thing pushes back on this idea of, replace your flesh with this shiny gold chrome stuff and you'll be popular and you'll look bougie and it'll be really good for you. Like, there's always a pushback on that. That's the counterculture, which is I think is really cool and interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up, because a game that I've seen come up on Cyberpunk lists that I would have never really thought to be Cyberpunk, but just based on Connor's description absolutely would be, is Final Fantasy VII.
Yes, it is. It is.
Sure.
And what's
definitely
interesting to me is, like, I would never have put that in that place just because it existed as Final Fantasy VII, this thing. Like I said, growing up, didn't really see that. But like replaying it through the eyes of the remake that just came out recently, like, from Barrett's lines, though still kind of a horrible racial stereotype, though better, not great, but better. He has a gun arm, and and he's part of a terrorist organization, so let's call it what it is, because in that world, that's how it's viewed, regardless if they're trying to do the right thing to save the planet. And so I just really think that it's interesting to now look at it through that lens, but Shinra is absolutely that giant corporation that you're talking about, Connor, that you want to fight back against, that is purposely killing the planet. And how are they doing it? By trying to use its power against it, using, machinations and materia and things created by Shinra, because in the new game, we see that Shinra is perfecting the creation of certain materia and that it's come from their creation process. It's just really interesting, because I don't think that was ever very explicit in the original game, or if it was, you could easily miss it, that like a lot of the technology and weapons and things that you're using are things that were at least at one point perfected by Shinra.
Yeah, well, and even the fact that the mayor's office for Midgar is in the Shinra building. Yeah. And it's even even in the original 1997 game, it's pointed out, it's like, I'm the mayor of the city, but I'm mostly a figurehead. It's, it's like if Con Ed ran Manhattan.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
But also was headed up the military industrial complex of the world.
It's pretty on the nose, yeah. I'm the mayor of Midgar, brought to you by Shinra. By the way.
Even the joke, it sort of came through in the translation. The names of both the mayor and the deputy mayor were meant to be jokes on pizza places. Mayor Domino, and it was a deputy mayor Hart, but it was meant to be Hut.
That's amazing.
Which could just be like the delightful punnage of Japanese pop culture, but also like even not just the corporations being politics, the politicians are corporate.
That's awesome.
But
and it's amazing what you don't pick up on when you first play a game as a kid. Like you mentioned, Matt. There's a lot of stuff that just went over my head back then. And quick confession I have to make, I actually never played all the way through Final Fantasy VII. I watched my older brother play it, though.
Okay.
And so there was...
the first part of the game is the most cyberpunk part. Then you get out of the city and it becomes like fish out of water. It's a regular Final Fantasy, but also cyberpunk.
Yeah, there's that little sprinkling of cyberpunk on the top, kind of dusted in, but it's like you don't think of Final Fantasy VII as cyberpunk because fantasy's in the name. It's not cyberpunk, it's fantasy.
It's just future fantasy.
But no, a bit of a crossover though, which is cool.
No, it absolutely is, and it's also funny to look at other just sprinklings of titles that have cyberpunk aesthetics or cyberpunk ideals, and I'd like to touch on a couple of things that I look at and go like, this is probably why this was like kind of pervasive I certainly see it in the 16-bit era of, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and a lot of arcade titles around the time as well. It was like 89 to 94, I'd say, like early 90s. So there's a couple of things going on. One, it was the end of the millennium. And so Matt and I did an episode a while ago about the notion of what video games saw as the future and how we are living in the year 2020, which was absolutely the catchy year that was always the far future. You know, Neon Knight Riders and Turtles in Time was in 2020. The Super Baseball with robots was in 2020. And so there's a bit of that. There's a bit of the end of the Cold War. So there's a bit of the notion of who are our enemies, what is the fight, and this idea that, you know, corporations will take over everything, because there was also a lot of deregulation of tax law in the 80s, which then led to like a rise in billionaires and all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and coupled with a technological boom of Japan of the 70s and 80s, and how in a lot of cyberpunk, the notion of Neo-Tokyo or like Eastern elements of whether it's Japan, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's, you know, pick a city in Asia in that of that time, and that becomes the future sense of it. You know, there was an interesting perfect storm of all kinds of stuff. You know, so you get Strider in the future, Cyber Ninja, whatever.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Neo Tokyo reminds me of a game I loved growing up was Time Splitters 2.
Sure, yeah.
And there's a iconic level in that game called Neo Tokyo. Literally takes place in like the city Tokyo in, I'm gonna ballpark it, the year 2020 something. It's something around there. It's a good point though. Every futuristic property was like, hey, it's 2020 now. And what was funny about the Neo Tokyo level though is it was a bit of a premonition of like a hyper security state type thing where everything was monitored. It's a surveillance state, I guess I would call it. There's security cameras on every corner, and a big part of that level was you had to be careful where you walked. You didn't want to get caught on cameras, and you were trying to infiltrate this base, and there are cameras everywhere. So that was part of like that. You know, people creating popular media, people creating a video game, they'll think, what's the future going to be like? Are we going to be monitored all the time? And that comes back to, you know, things like 1984, just people back in the 50s, like George Orwell, thinking in the future we're gonna be there's no such thing as privacy.
Yeah,
like we're looking down the road and we're assuming, you know, well, making an educated guess really that in the future privacy will be a thing of the past. And I don't know, I remember where I was going with this, but you made me think of that post Cold War optimism and kind of imagining, well, what's our identity now? Yeah. We're not afraid of the Russians anymore. The Reds aren't a problem anymore. So what now? And in the 90s, you know, I'm a 90s kid. I think a lot about like grunge music and all that angst. But then in the late 90s, that gave way to a little bit more of a poppy sort of pop culture where people started to realize, dude, it's the 90s. Cold War's over. What do we have to be depressed about? What do we have to be anxious about? It's all, everything's good. Things are good now. And people started to assume technology's going to get way cool, way fast right now. Like people started to just assume that, yeah, in 2020 we're gonna have robot baseball. Like why wouldn't we? Because it's the 90s, things are great and technology's advancing. So I feel like the futuristic properties that gave way to Cyberpunk kind of came out of that optimistic place of people assuming that technology is gonna be mind-blowing pretty soon, and then that just didn't happen.
I mean,
it's just fun to think about.
It is mind-blowing. It's just not that kind of mind-blowing.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we do have Blazeball, which is essentially robot baseball. We do have that in 2020.
I'll have to look that up. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean,
that sounds fun.
It's Blazeball, from my understanding, because I don't participate, but it's like an algorithm generated like baseball system because there's no actual live games, and it's fake teams and fake players, and it's like fantasy baseball without the actual players. It's really bizarre, and like I might even be explaining it wrong because I didn't jump in as much as other friends of mine have. But it's funny, you know, talking about how looking back we projected the future and we may or may not have gotten stuff wrong, talking about the years. For this past Monday, if you haven't heard it yet, the Screen Snark Cyberpunk Week episode is about Johnny Mnemonic. We did with the incredible Patrick Willems. And like that takes place in February of 2021. So we're getting close. And there are no cybernetic dolphins, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world.
We better get cracking on that then.
We better.
Not a lot of time left.
I don't know every dolphin, so who's to say?
But that said, you know, talking about looking back and then now being there and looking back for sure, like even games that have nothing to do with Cyberpunk have parodied Cyberpunk. I mean, the biggest example that I can think of that just pops into my head is Neo Bowser City for Mario Kart. It debuted in 7 and it's in 8 and 8 Deluxe. And it is absolutely like that Neo Tokyo kind of aesthetic. But in Mario, there's no explanation for the stage. We don't know if they've gone into the future or if it actually is canonical in Mario. As I assume most of the Mario Kart stages are not canonical in the world of Mario.
Yeah, what is Rainbow Road? I mean, really?
Yeah. Mario games in general lack a lot of context that I'd really like to have. Like, who are Dry Bones and why are we in their desert? Like, who are these people?
I know. Polygon Unraveled thing about the hierarchy of Bowser's armies is a perennial favorite for that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's
another recommendation.
Hilarious. Yes.
It's very good.
But, you know, it does, like, Cyberpunk has become so pervasive that it is parodied in a lot of places. And like even rewatching Johnny Mnemonic, like certain things that they predicted absolutely did happen to a degree. Like we're not plugging into our brains, but we absolutely have devices that we can carry that are small, that we could input, you know, upload a certain amount of gigs to and take with us. And digital couriers are absolutely a thing. I've seen people deliver hard drives for businesses and for other things. So like, you know, they didn't get it spot on, but, you know, they hit the mark somewhere around the bullseye.
Right.
But when do we get a Keanu Reeves flash drive?
Right, exactly.
Like, I need to find a 3D printer for completely unrelated reasons. You talk amongst yourselves.
And of course, now Elon Musk wants to literally put microchips in our brains. So there's it's on its way. We'll see where that goes. But there are people at least thinking about it. And, you know, I'd be more comfortable if someone else was thinking about it rather than him. But
fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, and because there again, it's that push and pull of humanity being uplifted by technology or technology being used to control, and you get some interesting. Again, I'm going to put aside this entire binder of my philosophical arguments and then point out the interesting because Johnny Mnemonic was part of. I can't properly speak to the waves of cyberpunk pop culture.
Right.
Like this is just within my own head. This academic idea exists only within my noggin. There is the early 90s wave where you get the Johnny Mnemonics, you get the first wave of Shadowrun digital products where you get that sort of like cybernetic enhancement technologies that we think will exist in 30 years that do, but they don't exist within our bodies. They exist within like our phone or something else. And then there is a second wave that comes, like, I want to say 1999 to 2003, which is, I mean, The Matrix is kind of not the start of the wave, but it's definitely its crest, where the cyberpunk ideals change from technology and cybernetics to internet and connectivity and what we can do with that, which is where you get your Deus Ex.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I mean, even The Matrix had a video game tie-in that was part of the narrative and done in a way that not a lot of other movie to video games things have done. Like it takes place, it fills in the gaps between movies in the same way the Animatrix did. And like, love it or hate it, The Matrix had a pretty clear trajectory for what they were looking to do. And we actually are going to have a bonus episode this week of of Matrix Revolutions as well, with one of the folks over at Geek Elite Media joining Case Aiken. And like, it's really interesting to me to watch how certain franchises handle that. And I hadn't really thought about internet and digitizing and VR even being included in that cyberpunk wave. But, you know, we are creating extensions of our body with virtual reality as well, in a way that, like, of course, like, makes sense towards that cyberpunk narrative, right? Putting ourselves in these games, in these worlds. Like, one of the cheesiest things about Johnny Mnemonic is, like, he jacks in, puts on a visor, and he's in the internet, man. It's brightly colored. It's like,
whoa.
And it's one of those things that's, like, it's so goofy. And, like, I was watching it with my spouse, and she's just like, this is terrible. Like, and I said, yeah, there are PlayStation games that came out 10 years ago that look better than this at this point.
Yeah, but the PS1 was like the encapsulation of the early 90s cyberpunk aesthetic that now runs through my veins. Like the PS1 version of it.
Yeah.
So, like, power to him for the aesthetic.
For sure.
Just speaking of The Matrix, though, I find it interesting how not only did The Matrix sort of popularize this concept of, cybernetic warfare and hijacking the system and machines being the enemy. It also made a lot of us in the popular consciousness think about that concept of, is life a simulation? And that, I think that's another theme of Cyberpunk, where it's, can you trust your reality? That's another thing that pops up here and there. Like, is what you're seeing real, and how do you know the difference? And they make mentions in the movie to, I think, a book called Simulation or something like that. I'm probably butchering the name, but it's a philosophical work that kind of deals with those really heavy ideas of, what is reality? Is it just perception? Is it verified perception? And is it a shared perception? And things like that. And, I think people started, that became like part of meme culture almost too, where people started joking around about it. Like, I would like us to reset the simulation, please. This sucks. And like, it's just,
yeah,
people are really like hyper aware of that. It's just part of our shared experience now, that we've all kind of accepted that maybe none of this is real. Who would know? Like, how can you tell the difference? How would you even know? So it's just something to think about all. It's all kind of always in the back of our heads at all times.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those things that what I like about as video games get more realistic is that, the concepts make us wrestle with real life stuff. And like, I've talked endlessly about the BioWare games that I love that really make you think about storytelling and inhabiting character in a different way than a lot of other games do. But that said, there's something to be said about games that allow you to move through the narrative as a character that's not you, that you can kind of distance yourself from and just see where the choices take you as well. And I feel like Cyberpunk has always done that really well. It's one of those things, like, again, going back to Human Revolution, which is the most recent Cyberpunk game I can think of that I've played a lot of, where even though you're not Adam Jensen is a character who's established, who exists, you can influence his decision because you're controlling him. And there's this weird conflict of your personality versus Adam, because he will react sometimes in a way like you don't get the heavy level of choice management that per se a Mass Effect would give, but you still have some direction and some, like, you could take a stealthier path or just go in guns blazing, be more violent, kill everybody, not kill anybody, that kind of thing. Dishonored did a lot of that too, which was more sort of fantasy, sort of like Dishonored exists in this world where, like, if Cyberpunk but in D&D, I feel like, and I've not played a lot of Dishonored, but like, that's another game where how you proceed through the game and the decisions you make affect your humanity, whether you're killing everybody or stealthily taking out the essential people and moving through. And it's even playing bigger games. Like, I start thinking about this more because, I think all of the touchstones we've talked about with Cyberpunk are all true, right? And like, it's a branching genre that grows and shifts and changes as the popular culture changes. But I think the battle with your own humanity is something that I identify a lot and struggle with those games. It's why I like the Mass Effect games so much, is because the Renegade and Paragon choices are pretty binary in the early parts of Mass Effect. But as you go through that narrative and the choices are linked, it becomes less binary. It becomes more complicated. My favorite example is whether you find the rogue heretic Geth and whether you rewrite them or kill them. There's no right answer there. You're either going against someone's will to alter their mind state without their permission, or you're killing them. It's genocide. Both choices suck. But you and many of our guests on the show on Reignite, also on this network, have rationalized why we've made those decisions, because ultimately neither decision is correct. Both of them are bad.
Right.
And I feel like Cyberpunk makes us approach those kinds of decisions and face those kinds of realities a lot more than a lot of other genres.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned Dishonored. There's this term that I heard applied to Dishonored back when it was, kind of a new franchise, and I was first playing through it. I heard it described as something called dieselpunk. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term at all, but it makes me think of, like, what are the common threads between these punk aesthetics and kind of genres, where steampunk, cyberpunk, dieselpunk, like, what connects them is, I think, is this common theory of technology looking a certain way in a certain setting that we in the real world can kind of relate to, but only to a certain point. Like, we look at a dieselpunk world like Dishonored, and it's like, I can sort of understand this world, but it's just different enough that it's alien to me. But it's also just relatable enough that I can feel like I inhabit it and I can interact with it. And of course, there's the punk aspect where it's still like there's something vaguely dystopian about it, and there's some sort of pushback against. There's a counterculture, and I when you think about Dishonored, how the world is run on whale oil, you think like you might look at that and say that's just ridiculous. That's crazy. How could a world run on whale oil? But then you think, well, no, I mean our world's kind of run on dinosaur bones, and like we have this kind of technology too. Yeah, it's like that's what I mean by it. It's like just alien enough. It's just different enough, but there's still that nugget of I can relate to this world a little bit. It's crazy.
It's true. And I think a punk aspect of things is, one, it definitely gets thrown around like you sprinkle it into the genre, into whatever you're calling your genre. But for me, a punk ethos also brings into account, again, looking out for your fellows and looking out for people, and sometimes taking a very hard stance in defense of people, in defense of community, in defense of the people around you and the people who can't speak for themselves.
Right. And
there is that sort of Robin Hooding aspect, I suppose, to like, slicing in cyberpunk genres, or, being the hacker that takes down the big corporation. But it also, this is jumping around a little bit, but I was thinking still on the notions of enhancements and loss of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of to your point of looking at something that seems absurd in a fictional aspect and then just realizing it is analogous to something else that is already happening.
Right.
In much the same way that like all of the things that we thought would be jacked into in the 90s and early aughts are really just external technologies that we now have. We do have cybernetic enhancements, but it's how we interact with the world. Technology has allowed us to connect to greater repositories of knowledge, wider communities. Indie games can succeed in an interesting way nowadays because you can reach your niche audience in a far better fashion and they can find each other, which is a way that technology can uplift us. But because we are also taking in so many viewpoints at the same time, it becomes, if 2020 is anything, it shows the sheer exhaustion that comes about trying to connect and understand on a constant basis. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop, but it does mean we need to reckon with it. And there is no chip that goes in that fixes that right now. And right now I don't want there to be. But all of this to bring up the idea that you put a chip in your head, you replace your arm, you've enhanced your nervous system to speed up your reflexes, you're losing your humanity. You are able to connect to more people whose face you never see. You can voice chat over games. You can hear about statistics. If you see everybody, do you see nobody? Does everybody become a statistic? And as much as we can try to, for all of the emotional resonance moments, like what do we do with the Geth? Like what choice do you make at the end of which game to save or kill? We often play games where we will mercilessly mow down zeros and ones. And when does a human, like even a human's digital avatar, also become just the zeros and ones that we no longer care about? That is the loss of humanity that interests me, that a lot of more modern games and more modern cyberpunk-ish meta-narrative games get to. Those ideas of, are you doing this because you can get away with it? Are you doing it because greater internet fuckwad theory of anonymity is, we've had 40 years of video games that teach us go right, shoot enemy in so many ways, or make choice, do that. And we're now getting a lot of interesting pushback in, okay, but why though?
Yeah. No, I agree. And like, there was a very bad movie that engaged with this on a human level, which was Gamer, starring Gerard Butler.
Oh, yeah.
Where it was about convicts who are controlled by gamers in a first-person shooter-ish match, and they're augmented to be controlled so they can win their freedom if they work together. And like, it was not a good movie, but it did bring up interesting questions. Like, when you're like, these convicts, these are people who did horrible things. So do they have no humanity? Meanwhile, of course, Gerard Butler's character was someone who might have been framed and was put in there, you know, because of course. But like, we are at a point now, I feel like, with Cyberpunk and with futurism of every kind, that we're wrestling with not only the loss of humanity and the ones and zeros, but like, what does that mean when there's more humanity behind the ones and zeros, where people are directly controlling those things? And I think that this is a genre that will continue to evolve and will become something very different in a similar way in the late 90s, how, you know, Matrix brought it to like the virtual world and internet and connectivity in a way that earlier things couldn't predict. I think after 2020, what's defined as futurism and what's defined as like what's next, what are we imagining, will be altered deeply by 2020 as a year, as well as stuff within the last few years.
Yeah,
we got 10 years till FM 2030 is gonna, like, before they try to unfreeze him. Like, we got to give him something good here.
To dovetail off that, I think you've both made amazing points, just in the vein of that empathy fatigue thing you mentioned, Geoff. Just like, there's so much suffering, and we all try to be aware of it. We all try to, you know, be compassionate about it, but there's a limit to like how much you can really experience and still empathize with. You start to wear out those neurons in your brain that let you process it. They just start to get worn out. They get tired, and I think that ties into that idea of, you know, replacing your body with cybernetics isn't inherently losing humanity, because we do that today. And like you mentioned, Matt, a while ago, like, that doesn't make you less human if that's just how you're doing it. You're just doing it to survive. That's how you survive. But I think it goes deeper than that, where, you know, if you no longer have that commonality with other people, and you're just so much machinery, and it's already hard to have empathy, I think that's when you start to lose the connections to other people. That's when communities start to fall apart. That's when, and you see that in cyberpunk media. You know, people no longer place importance on communities and being there for each other. They just, all they care about is the shiny new augment. And it's just amazing to me that I like that. I like that point of the punk part of cyberpunk and steampunk and dieselpunk, or whatever punk media there is.
And punk.
Yeah, just hardcore punk, post-punk, whatever you like. But no, like, there's that idea of community. It's very core to the very DNA of punk. And I'm going to put on my combat boots, leather jacket, and style my mohawk real quick. And I'll just say that standing up for the little guy, the little person, is very punk. That's what
it's extremely
that's
punk.
what it's all about. And you do see that in Deus Ex. You see that in Shadowrun a little bit, where like there are little people getting stepped on every day. And you can't, even if you're a cyborg and you're a killing machine and you know, your nerves of steel and all, like literally nerves of steel and all that, you can still make that choice to stand up for the little guy and build a community and push back on the dominant culture. And that's extremely punk. That's what it's all about.
It is, because that's it's a way to combat that empathy fatigue. Is if you try to change the world entirely by yourself, that's exhausting.
Yeah.
And we've been given such a fast track to corporate product individualism. You know, we identify by what consoles we play or which games we do, or like I mean, yes, we're all living in isolation right now, but even before that, the like, how cool is your specific thing? But by sharing the load, by, you know, sharing the information, by, you know, pushing those things along, it may not be as attractive as jacking the net, but if anyone who's ever hacked or coded before, it's not that exciting, no matter how many LEDs you throw on it. So honestly, you're losing nothing.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, totally. Well, this has been a great conversation about the genre, and honestly, us discussing it makes me excited for what we're going to get in the future. I think 2020 is going to be a defining year for what games look like coming up over the next decade,
for sure.
Especially with the better technology and the new consoles, if we can ever get one. Because the bots they made
one day,
the bots that were created to steal them from websites and resell them are more powerful than anything else.
Oh yeah. You know what? The drones are not the cyberpunk future I wanted.
No, didn't ask for that. To quote Adam Jensen,
but before we
never asked for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I would like to give Connor an opportunity to promote Lore Party. Tell the listeners a little bit about what you do over at Lore Party, maybe some of the stuff you've worked on over there, and what folks can look forward to seeing on the site.
For sure. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. Lore Party is all about really diving deep into the universes, stories, and characters of popular games and hidden gems alike. And we really try to just be complete lore nerds and really tease out what little hidden messages or themes or plot lines that might be right beneath the surface. And we have a lot of very great, very detailed episodes. And we've actually spun off a few series recently from the Witcher series we have called Winds Howling. It's actually a companion podcast to the Netflix series. We recently spun off a show called Gom Jabbar, which is all about the Dune franchise. I've never read a Dune book, but just from what I've heard from Abu and Leo, who are the hosts, it's just a mind-blowingly amazing, like crazy deep franchise that maybe one day I'll have the guts to dive into. But yeah, we also recently, my co-host Bruce and we've been spending a lot of time on the Doom games, not to be confused with Dune. We're talking that classic boomer shooter, DOOM, Doom, baby. And
one is the spice is life, the other is the shotgun is life.
Exactly.
Very well put. And yeah, we've had a great time. You might not think that the Doom games, especially the recent ones or even the old ones, have a lot of lore to them, but you'd be surprised. So Bruce and I have been just really embarrassing ourselves with how much we're nerding out about like the Slayer and Heaven and Hell and things like that. So that's been fun. But yeah, we're actually winding down our most recent season right now, and then in the new year we'll be kicking off with some brand new stuff. So stay tuned. Oh, also we recently had an interview with Yuri Lowenthal, the actor who portrayed Spider-Man in the recent PS4 games, which was an amazing conversation. Just want to shout out that really quick. My buddies Lawrence and Kevin led that interview with Yuri, and it was amazing conversation. It was a great time. So check that out. And don't be strangers. We're on Twitter. You can find us. Check us out. And hope you enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Connor, for joining us again. We're so excited to be a part of this crossover. And thank you for joining us for Extra Life this year and partaking in our Ridiculous Among Us games. Like it was
happy to.
It was a lot of fun. It's fun to team up with another podcast network that really wants to just celebrate the joy of video games, which is what we do on the show very deeply. And so thank you for taking the time to join us. You can find out more about Lore Party at lore_party on Twitter. You can also go to their website, loreparty.com. Before we wrap up the show, I do want to shout out translifeline.org. It will be in the show notes as well. Please give and donate. This helps trans folks in need who need support in any way, shape, or form. I think it's really important to give to that cause, especially now as they're continually persecuted in this country and lots of other places. So I just wanted to shout that out. Yeah. But also, thank you to the listener. Thank you for joining us. You can, of course, find us at certainpov.com. We have an invite link to our Discord server where we talk about all sorts of stuff, not necessarily always as heavy as this is. But we are super thankful to be, again, a part of Cyberpunk Week. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to see more stuff like this or want us to partner up with other networks, please send us an email, tweet at us, shoot us send a carrier pigeon, however you want to get in touch.
Yeah, if you're another podcast network and you want, let us know. We can do direct correspondence on this. And let us know what you thought of this. If you want us to do deep dives into other genres, what are your favorite Cyberpunk games? What are the games that you like that you think are Cyberpunk, but not everybody else does? Like, I think Metal Gear Solid's a Cyberpunk series, and I would argue that, nanomachines. So, and you know what? Argue with me about that. I will argue about Metal Gear Solid for days.
It's true, he will.
All this to be said, it's all being part of the conversation. And if anything, what we've been talking about with Trans Life and Cyberpunk and everything else, community and conversation is important. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Can you believe we've been friends for 7 years?
And it all started because I compared you to Alana the Lioness.
Tamara Pierce really set the tone of our friendship.
A love of magic,
Briar Moss,
fantasy,
Briar Moss,
powerful women, and of course,
Briar Moss. I'm Anna.
And I'm MJ.
And we invite you to join our Circle of Friendship,
where we do a chapter-by-chapter deep dive into the Circle of Magic series by Tamara Pierce.
We answer important questions like, how does Moonstream let certain dedicates take care of children?
Can you imagine anyone else but Mandy Patinkin playing Nico?
Knives, Briar?
And
knives?
Join us every other Monday at cofpodcast.libsyn.com or wherever you download podcasts.
But seriously, knives?
CPoV. CertainPOV.com.